Welcome to the Writer's Realm podcast, and thank you for joining us as we journey through writing together. We're your hosts,
Bob?
Holly Rebelliard.
and Austin Matthews. And today we're going to talk about religion in fantasy. So, is this something that y'all actually consider doing? Like, is that something that takes part in your fantasy worlds?
Yes. Mine is steampunk science fiction slash,
Mhm.
so it is during the Victorian era where, Christianese was going hot and heavy. Catholicism was a real thing. So one of my characters does, I include prayer journal entries in some of the chapters she talks about, but so it's there, but
Mhm.
it's not, it's definitely not preachy. It's just like, well, yeah,
Mhm.
and they get into it. So she's a detective, and then my other character is a vampire assassin, and so they have in the first book they get into this debate about killing, right? And
Mhm.
my main character is like, no, no, killing is not. It's bad, pretty much. It's against what I believe in and all that. And of course, I
Mhm.
bring her twice to a place where she's forced to do something,
Right.
and is she gonna hold to her beliefs, or and then my vampire, of course, is like, hey, it just needs to get done. I'm taking out the trash. I'm taking out the trash, and it's gonna stay in the trash can. That's what I'm doing. She doesn't kill willy nilly. She's more
Mhm.
of kill the bad guys kind of thing. So
Yeah. So,
that's where I'm at with my religion in my book so far.
nice. So you got kind of like a Superman character of like, yeah, I could kill these people, but I'm gonna choose not to. And then
Right.
a Dexter-ish character where it's like,
Right.
hey, whatever, it's the bad guy,
Yeah.
they deserve it.
And I do have a cult, actually. Now that I'm thinking about it, there's an overarching theme of um, like a larger space, a cosmic god, right? Like a Cthulhu kind of a character. So there is a cult going on who they worship. So there is that going on too, burning in the background. So yeah,
Just a
I definitely
small
do
like
have.
eldritch horror thing, like not a
That's
big
it.
deal.
Yeah, not a big deal. Not a big deal.
There we go. It's so weird.
There
It
we
just
are.
popped up and said your microphone cannot be detected. I'm like, what do you mean? I was just using it.
You can't move around, Holly. You cannot move around.
There'll be no touching of anything
No
now.
touching of anything. Keep your hands up on your shoulders or whatever.
I don't use, I guess I shouldn't say I don't. So I have multiple gods in my world. So they're there. So there is some sort of religion aspect to what I'm writing, but it's not there in that it's explored very much. So it's there, we know that it's there, but I haven't gone deep into it really affecting any of the characters in the story at this point. And I don't think it's probably not something that I'm going to really get into for this book that I'm currently working on, but it's definitely, I'm doing it in a way like with my world building so that in the future when I know that I need to lean onto it, that it's going to be there and it makes sense. Because I think that can be really hard sometimes.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah, that's something too. It's like I feel like it's something that like it just makes the world feel fuller, whether you actually like really are diving into it or not. So like my first book, like it kind of dealt with it, but like the surfacey kind of stuff. Like even though some of the character, I guess actually the entire main cast of characters were considered gods, it was like they didn't really talk about the religion because they were like the focal points of it. So like to them it's like yeah whatever, like people worship us and it's kind of weird, but like that's not what this story is about. And so I think in my other stories where it's like, okay, it's a peripheral thing, but it's just it's one of those things. It's like it's such a part of our world that it almost feels foreign to like not have anybody thinking about like this way of exploring, especially if you're dealing with like fantasy. It's like you have these wonderful things like magical miracles happening. What's the source of it? And like, yeah, okay, it's magic, but like, why are they not, personifying the source of that? I feel like that's such a hard thing to explain away. Like, people want to see conscious entities in the natural world. So,
Yeah, and it's part of world building, right? We're
mhm.
creating this whole, we got characters and we got a castle and we have some lands. But honestly, just about every single culture throughout our real earth, like everyone worships something almost, even if it's money or your job. But it's just part of world building. Like
Mhm.
it's and like I mentioned, it could be the forefront or it could be in the background, right? It just
Yeah.
depends on what the story is all about.
Yeah, so, like, I have one world that takes place, and, like, the religion's very, like, Shinto inspired, so very Japanese traditional, religion where it's, like, the everything has this soul or a spirit, so, like, thinking about, like, kind of a Brandon Sanderson with the Sprin in, his Stormlight Archives, it's very Shinto inspired, I feel like, and so just, like, that idea of, like, okay, like, there's all these things around, and then it gets involved in one of the later stories where, the chosen heroes of the world, like, are bound their souls to the spirits, and, like, that's the source of the magic, but it's, like, an unrelated book, but it's introduced early on because it's, like, that's part of the world, and it's, like, it would feel very out of left field. It's like, "Oh, yeah, you've been on this planet for 3 books," and then suddenly it's like, "Oh, yeah, there's spirits everywhere, don't worry about where they were in the other books."
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I feel like a lot of the fantasy books that I read anyways, and maybe it's just the ones that I'm into, um, but I feel like lately every book that's come out has multiple gods, and I wonder if a lot of that is for 2 reasons. The first one I feel like is a lot of people lean more on, like, the Norse mythology, um, we know which has so many different gods. And I think that that heavily influences a lot of people's work. And I also am curious as to how many people steer away from more modern religion because they're just afraid to do it incorrectly. And then, that obviously is going to, tank book sales for something like that. So I'm curious as to how much, if that's why a lot of people seem to be steering away from it. I mean, for me, that's one of the reasons I did is because I didn't know a lot about modern day religion. Um, and with all the other world building I was doing, I just didn't think it was going to play an important enough role in this book to actually research it. But that would be interesting to hear from someone else's perspective to see if that's why.
Yeah, I'm currently reading Joe Abercrombie's First Law trilogy, and there's mention they do have some religion going on there, and I was surprised that um, so far they're talking. One of the races in the book is talking about worshiping a god, a capital G god, which would be probably something our Western culture would be familiar with. But yeah, that's yeah. I mean, I think that's a good topic. Like, try to figure out. Well, I want to, but how do I not? How do
Yeah.
I not make it offensive, right, to anyone else's real religion or their culture, right?
Yeah, because I mean that's the complicated thing. Like especially if you're writing urban fantasy or, anything set in our world is like dealing with the fact that like this is a real thing that real people believe. And even if there's not a lot of them, like yeah, Norse mythology feels safe because, most people aren't running around like praising Odin. But like, what about if like that doesn't mean you can't respect the faith? And I think that coming through like with that mindset of like I'm trying to come through and respect the aspects of this religion. It's just important no matter what you're doing, whether it's, directly like, oh, hey, here's Odin or here's Allah or here's, the Christian God, like whatever you're doing, coming at it with respect and those kind of things. And just being like, how would I want somebody to talk about my religion or my faith? Whether you're religious or not, we all have our belief systems. And like, that's something that needs to be handled with respect and like I was gonna say delicacy, but that sounds like food. With a delicate hand, and so just being really cognizant of the fact that like this is something that matters deeply to people. And when you look at like Maslow's like hierarchy of needs, like he came back after he had finished the 5 heart like layers and was like, no, there's something bigger than self actualization. There's this spiritual transcendence. Like that is the biggest need in our lives. Like once you have everything else, the thing you still are lacking is that transcendence. And so like it's the core of who we are.
Mm,
And so yeah, you just have to be careful with it. And I think a lot of people are just like, well, I'll make up my own religion because it's way more work, but at the same time it's also less work because it's like the ins and outs of it and like what'll offend people in your world and like it's easier to play with those things in a lot of ways because you
mm,
can just kind of take the pieces of your own faith and like put them into those characters.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's something too that if you are really wanting to add a religious aspect to your work, I think it's important that you need to build that. You need to really focus on building that in the beginning of your world, because you build entire communities, entire cultures are built around religion, right? And so you can't have a work where these people are supposed to be extremely religious, and that they really rely on religion, and then you don't have a temple or you don't have a place of worship, or you don't have those things in place. It just doesn't make sense. So I think it's really important that if you are going to go that route, that you do your research in advance, or you create religion as part of your world instead of just tossing it in there, if it's going to be something that's going to be a focus point in your work.
Hmm. And I think, and also to avoid like offending someone, you can either make it up in your head, like, okay, well, I got to be careful, or just kind of maybe pretend like your own group of friends, because that's what most religions are. It's just like a community of people, with a belief system. And if you were to just kind of go, well, what would be offensive to me and my friends, and maybe make a list, not to include it in the book. I mean, maybe if that's part of the story or something. But I think that would kind of help you. Like for those that I have that don't have a belief system and they don't follow anything, that's fine. You don't, you could either do some research and look around, or ask some, talk to some people, or you could just kind of look at it like that. Like, well, what would be something offensive that my family wouldn't like, or my group of friends wouldn't like, and maybe kind of build it up from there. Um, but I've seen, we've all read books, plenty of books that have dealt with religion. I can't remember anything. I feel like everyone's on the same level. All of us writers, we don't want to offend anybody with anything,
Mhm.
so much
Yeah,
so
it's not
that
usually the
it's
purpose.
usually, yeah, we want to entertain, and we want to escapism, or we just want to maybe push an agenda. I don't know.
Hmm.
I don't know what your purpose of writing would be, but yeah, I mean, that's definitely at the very bottom. We do not want to offend anybody, so we're all going to be very careful with this. Um, and I feel like we're all, even though some of us are more further along in the writing journey than others, we're all in the same playing field with that. We can all come to agreement. Hey, I'm not sure what, like, say, Buddhists. I know a little bit, but maybe learning, well, what else is there? What is there? A single? Is it an idea? Is it a practice? Oh yeah, what do they practice? Is it
Yeah,
something they wear? Is it something they pray to or meditate on? Or there's
yeah,
so many different holes to fill with this, and you can have a lot of fun with it without
yeah.
being offensive at all.
Well, and two, like speaking specifically of Buddhism is like it's such an interesting example of like where to start with like a faith, because it's like if you want to talk about, there being disparate ideas of what a faith is, like, yeah, Christianity has all these like different like denominations and things like that. You got Catholics and Orthodox and Baptists and all this. But it's like, okay, well, in Buddhism, is Buddha to be worshipped? Is it a religion? Is it a philosophy? Like, there's so many different interpretations.
Right.
And so, like, whenever you're looking at a fantasy religion, like, nothing is a monolith. And so, like, your
Hmm.
fantasy religion shouldn't be either. Like, if everybody understands exactly what's going on with your fantasy religion, then it doesn't feel real
Hmm.
because, like, you know, you'll disagree with everybody about everything on the small details, at least. Like,
Right.
nobody's going to have exactly perfectly the same idea of any concept. Even if you're just reading, like, if we sat down and read like a 3-page short story, we'd have different ideas about what was being said.
Hmm. That's really
Yeah,
helpful.
yeah, so I think that the nice thing about religion as well is that it gives you an opportunity to create conflict in your story. And it gives you the opportunity to do it in a way that doesn't come across as just dumping information about your religion, right? Because if you have, someone who doesn't understand another character's religion, that's a great opportunity for a conversation. It could even be a great opportunity for a character to go on an adventure or take them to a new scene or a temple or something like that. Um, and explain it in a way that's not going to come across as like too aggressive, right? It'll be a little bit more natural when it's a conversation of someone explaining their religion to another character.
Right.
So I think that's really interesting. And obviously it can escalate from there as we have learned from our own history. But I think it's a good opportunity to a good thing you can take advantage of there.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think too, like, I feel like whenever I see religion in books, it's used in one of two things. It's either used as a dividing force or it's used as kind of a unifying force. Like, that's the two big roles that I tend to see it used for. But like, it can also be used in a little bit more nuanced ways where it's like you just have like the thing that jumps out to me is thinking about the like the temple gods or the household gods of like Roman culture. So like in the movie Gladiator, you have the main character kneeling and praying, and it's like nothing's talked about. He's just sitting there praying, and it's just like this moment of peace for him. Like you don't have to really get into, oh, this is the pan, like this is how all this works. It's just like this is something he turns to when he is like under stress, whenever he's worried about what's going to happen. And like you don't have to get into the weeds of it. Like I think that's something that like I feel like we want to explain because like, oh, we've already worked it all out. We want to share everything that we know with the reader because we don't want to waste a single word. But at the same time, maybe you're wasting words on the page. So yeah, just realizing that like
Mm,
it can be used in small instances and have almost more impact because it's not
mhm,
burdened by all of this extra book knowledge.
mm,
Yeah. Now, with that being said, I do think it's important to share the necessary information. Um, so after I've now said that I don't really have any religion in my book has a lot of witchcraft in it, which I guess to a lot of people would actually be,
yeah,
we think of it as just a fun thing, but it does actually have a religious basis to it.
right, yeah,
And so there's things that happen in my book where they have a way to, on one night a year, to access their ancestors or access the loved ones that they've had that have passed. And so as I was going through and writing, I ended up having to make notes for myself to go back and rephrase how I was saying it because the way that I was, the way that I was having them access their loved ones, it just didn't really make sense in terms of how the rest of the story and the rest of the world worked. Like it seemed like I was just suddenly like, oh, I need someone to talk to their ancestor over here. So let's just make that happen. Right. So I was leaving out little pieces of information that I should have had earlier on that I was withholding to not info dump. Um, but it turned out it was necessary. So
mm,
I know we talked about that before. I think in one of our world building episodes that it's okay to take that info dumping and stick it somewhere because you might need it later.
mhm,
And that can be especially important, I think, with religion because you really have to flesh that out for it to make sense.
mhm,
Yeah, that makes me think of Chekhov's gun because like the whole if you like you present like a gun in the first act, it should go off in the third. Well, the reverse is basically what you're talking about. It's like if you had a gun go off in the third act, you have to introduce it at some point. And so like if you're gonna have these religious moments, like you have to introduce why it's significant, why it's possible, all of those like foundational works before
right,
you just throw it in there. I mean, that's true of really anything like it you
mhm,
said it came up in a world building thing because it's such a necessary thing of like even if your main character suddenly like can fence like you should probably talk about them having some sort of like fighting training. It's like if your bookworm suddenly is like an expert swordsman, not really believable, and it's a problem.
mm,
Right. So with that being said, I have a question for all of us then.
mm.
If you were to go ahead and start a new book and wanted to start building out a new religion, what are the first steps that you would take?
That's a great question. I was just thinking that in my head because you had just said, wait a second, I have witchcraft going on. That is actually is a belief system. There is something there. So yeah, I mean, I almost feel like we need to make a checklist for or maybe our website. Like we haven't done very much with our website, but maybe I think we or on our Discord, we can make something on our Discord.
And
Um,
for our blog,
and for a blog, yeah, like a resource. Yeah, because religions usually it's something outside of ourselves. It's almost like a
Hmm.
recognition of our finite selves, and that we want to draw from something bigger, a bigger idea, a bigger person. I don't, either invisible or not, but like usually that's what it is. It's a higher power kind of a thing, either intelligence or philosophy or an actual deity. But yeah, I would start with, well, who, what are they going to believe in, and why are they going to believe in it? Is
Hmm.
it something that because we all, if we're talking about we're finite beings, let's say, then we're going to pass on. Death is inevitable. So then what's right? What's after that? And who do we? Is there someone to take our souls somewhere, or why is my character going to start a religion or practice this religion? It could be for better crops, so that's a totally different thing, or it could be for, you kind of mentioned the sword, like he's a swordsman. I mean, maybe there's a deity of
Hmm.
war or of skills, or something like that. So that's kind of like, I would be more like, what am I going to believe in, and why is my character going to
Mhm.
believe in that? That's where I would start.
Yeah, like, I think, like you're saying, like, having a role for it is, like, super important for, like, the individual story. But, like, if I'm starting a new world, like, usually it's, like, all my religions in one world are, like, loosely related. So, like, you can think of it like Abrahamic religions, like the uh, Judaism and Christianity and Islam, like they're all related to each other. And so I try and do that with my worlds where it's like I have this one core belief system that's like the truth, and then there's all these things that are skirting around it that are close to the truth. And so I think of the cosmogony, the story of the creation of like this is how things were, whether it's true or not. Like this is the core belief that this universe has about how it was created, and then go like, okay, well, like how does like living in this place change the way that they would see that, and how does that color the way that they look at that? And in fact, the one of the works that I was working on in November, the deities are considered devils by like our perspective, but like it's that whole Maslowian thing of like you see it as the fear of like starving, but it's like, oh, this is actually like the appreciation of having food. And it's like this idea of like I live in the desert, so like I see things differently than you see it as somebody who lives in a like an oasis. Like just getting that understanding that culture influences religion as much as religion influences culture as well. And so I try and start with the nugget and build out from there.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. For me, I kind of thought that it would be interesting, if you had like a more personable approach to it. So like a lot of self-reflection and things like that. And if this comes back to me originally being a philosophy writer, of course. And I think it would be really interesting, or if you're not really sure where to start, a good place is to think about like, what are your wants and desires, and what kind of things do you think would make the world a better place? How do you, what would that world look like to you?
Mhm.
And what could you do to make it happen? And from there, you can kind of build out on that. Like, I think that this would happen. Well, what kind of people would be interested in doing something like that? Or what kind of community would that look like? And then from there, you can build it out, right?
Mhm.
Um, with my my gods and goddesses that I'm working on right now, I, had to have myself a whole table going on because it was just getting, things were kind of just getting carried away from me. And when I first started writing, I kept thinking like, well, if I want to have a book that people like, I need to have a book that people can relate to. And everyone likes to write about, having seven gods or goddesses or having this. And so that is where I kind of went wrong, I think, because I was just trying to do what everybody else did. And so then as I started fleshing out the story a little bit more, I was like, if I had just done something that I had really thought about and that I had really enjoyed, this would have made a lot more sense.
Mm.
Because now I'm kind of having to like backpedal and fill in these spaces where, there probably
Mhm.
wouldn't have been spaces before if I had just, really reflected on what this religion and what this world should look like.
Mm.
So,
How about like, maybe we can look at it like we're interviewing somebody. Interview your character. Um, Whoever's, if you're like, yeah, square one, I don't have a religion. I want them to. So tell me, what is it? Why do you practice it? And how do you practice it? Is it just something that you always have in your head? Is there something that you have to read every day, or once a week, or once a month? Is
Mhm.
there something that you worship? Is it like, in the clouds, or is it something like man-made with your hands, like a little idol, or is it, or something that you wear, right? I mean, most religions, it's, you're gonna wear, like witches, I'm thinking of some sort of a robe, or and then there's different colors for the robes, and why do you do that? And but
Mhm.
like,
right.
but all this stuff is kind of like we're saying is should be just, don't put all of it in there. Like, don't,
Mhm.
let's treat the reader as an intelligent person who wants to try to figure some stuff out. Like,
Yeah.
you don't have to put every detail like what we're talking about and that you're discovering. Doesn't need to be all in there. Just some pieces of whatever's moving the story forward.
Yeah.
You know.
And like you said, like discovering is important. And so like for me, one thing that's like I like the big ideas, and then like I'm just gonna go through. I'm not gonna worry about the rituals, but like think about like every part of your life that is influenced by your belief system, whether you're like super religious in a traditional sense or not. Like we all have our belief system. So think about like everybody has to bury people. Like it's a fact of life. and how you choose to do that is influenced by your worldview, religious or not. And so, like, whenever your character buries somebody, like, that was the first thing that, like, really stopped and made me think about, like, oh, the religion in my fantasy world is like, well, they're not gonna, like, put them like bury them in the ground and put up a little like cross or anything. Like that's not what they're gonna do. So what are they gonna do? And it's like, well, I've got 8 gods and they were created by another one. So like they put little sticks in the ground with like one large stick and then like 8 little ones around it. And like that's how poor people buried their dead. And like whenever the sticks were gone, there was no marking for the grave. And like that was just this idea of like life is fleeting and so is the body. And like that builds out into other things and it gives you this flavor of like, oh, there's so much more going on. And you can just kind of discover it as you go. Just think about in my life, is this something that's tied to religion? And then it's like, okay, well, how would that be different in this world?
Yeah, I think going back to what you said earlier as well about how depending on what area you're from, religion can vary. Even the way that people respect their religion, right? Like you can have someone who goes to church religiously every weekend, or someone who goes, always goes to church on Sundays, or someone who only goes on Wednesdays. But then you also have people who are very loyal to their religion, but they never go to church or they never go to a place of worship. They do it from home, or, there's certain things that symbolize that for them. And so you don't have to limit yourself, right? And I will say, of all the people that I know that have religious backgrounds, if you ever interested in a religion and you want to ask someone, nobody's ever going to be offended if you ask them to explain their religion to you. They are going to absolutely love it. So I think that's a
Mhm.
really good way as well. And it really opens up the door again for you to do that research and say, hey, like if I, what would you consider offensive if someone, was to discuss your religion or things like that? I feel like they're very open about it. So that's definitely something I would recommend as well.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
I feel like kind of you're kind of going, well, you weren't necessarily talking about it, but just making the religion in your character believable. Like, because I'm thinking in my head, like what you just said was perfectly believable. I have, I have this belief system, and I'm very strong about it, but I'm not going to follow along with like everything that everyone else is doing. I guess, I can just do it from home, or, I
Hmm.
think that's very believable. I'd rather read that than someone who's just constantly, the character is constantly, has their own book verses, or constantly in touch with their deity. Like, I mean, that's a little unbelievable. Like, it's almost like a robot, and we want people, right?
Yeah.
We want someone who forgot their, um, I don't know, their little relic at home. And instead of running back, they're like, well, okay, I forgot it. I guess I'm going to go into battle without it and let's see what happens, kind of thing. I'd rather read about that, right?
Yeah. And I mean, like, that's the thing is like people aren't as cookie cutter as like, oh, the cleric is like, oh, I'm gonna do the right thing all the time. Like I'm a former missionary, but like I'd still go out drinking with friends at night. Like that's just what we do. Like we're people. Like we're not like these like pigeonholed things. And like neither should your characters, neither should be your fantasy religions. Like make them complicated, make them flawed. Like just like your characters have flaws, your religions can have flaws too. Like
Right.
that's fine. And, like, maybe that's a misinterpretation, maybe they're wrong, maybe it's just
Yeah.
complicated.
I definitely like the flawed character, the flawed, and this is such a ridiculous, this is such a ridiculous idea, or example, I should say. But from Dusk Till Dawn, it was an amazing movie. But one of their characters is this priest, right? He walked away from the faith because I think his wife died or something. So he's like mad at God or whatever. And he's just like, I don't want anything to do with it. I kind of like that. I want to know why, what happened. And of course, he comes back to faith because he has to kill some vampires.
Classic.
But yeah, maybe that was a perfect example. But yeah,
God,
I love those
Quentin
flawed
Tarantino,
characters.
man.
Yeah, I love those flawed characters. I'd rather, like I said, make if you're gonna create religion, make it believable, And I feel like your flawed character in the middle of this would be, because yeah, we're people. We all have flaws. It makes the character relatable and like, oh shoot, what do I do if I'm a oh, he couldn't admit his wife, huh? A priest and a wife. Anyway, I got all that wrong. Somebody correct me
I mean, it
there.
could have been his wife. Like, it's a thing. It's another other traditions have wives. Like, I remember
Yeah.
going to an Orthodox monastery to buy some alcohol, actually, because
Oh.
that's a thing. They have mead there. It's great. Europeans and their alcohol in monasteries is great. But like, there, like
That's
the
so
priest could get
funny.
married, and like,
Oh,
so
okay.
like just
Okay. Yeah.
watching a priest walk hand in hand with a woman with his kids, and it's like,
Oh,
oh, that's like a normal thing,
yeah.
and maybe a healthy thing because
Yeah.
people are people.
Probably very healthy. Yeah.
Yeah, something else I've noticed as well. I did it. I think we had talked about it when I was still working on the Blood Sky,
Mhm,
and I was like, if I don't actually have a hell, can my character still say like, "Oh hell," and that's also something that a lot of people forget is sometimes there's lingo or words that we use that come from like more of a modern religion, and if
mhm.
you don't have that modern religion and you're not working in a modern world, you have to remember you can't use those words because it
It's
just
true.
doesn't. I mean, you can, for sure you can, but it
But they
doesn't
don't
make
know.
sense.
But they wouldn't
Well,
know, right? Yeah.
it's it's a whole that's a whole complicated conversation. So,
Mm. Hmm.
yeah,
But where
because
would they?
that's getting into etymology. So it's like,
But they wouldn't. I mean, no, you could raise a kid, you know, like say bring a child over from Japan and
mhm,
or I'm sorry, it's, not Japan, but a culture where hell doesn't exist or something, and he would just have he would never say, "Oh, what the hell?" He would never say that because he wouldn't know anything about it,
mhm.
or he would just
Yeah.
maybe copy it from somebody else. But yeah, no, that's a great point. We
Yeah,
can
I
Yeah.
guess you would
absolutely.
have to consider like at what point does a word no longer have religious meaning, but then just
Mm,
becomes general slang.
yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, because like I had a beta reader that got onto me for using the word schlep in one of my books because it's like the Jewish culture doesn't exist there. I'm like, yeah, but it's also a
Mm,
word, and like
mm,
Yeah, exactly.
at some point you have to draw the line. Are you gonna
mm,
like the example I use is, are you gonna rename every element in the periodic table?
mm,
No.
mm.
Nobody wants to read that.
Yeah.
Like, sure, maybe have an appendices if you really want to,
Right.
but like it's fine. Like
Mm,
you have to choose where you're gonna draw the line. The important thing is that you are consistent with it. So like for me, I still say like, nowhere on earth, even though it's not on earth, because earth is a word for solid ground,
mm.
and that's where we get the word
That
earth
makes
from,
sense. Yeah.
not vice versa. Because like they're synonymous in most every language.
Mm,
Because earth isn't earth in Italian, it's terra. But we
mhm,
also use that for ground and for the planet.
mm.
So it's like you have to choose where you're gonna draw the line. But like, hell makes sense because if you don't believe in an underworld or whatever, like that that's a little different, but
Yeah.
it's
But I feel
complicated.
like we all get the idea, though. If you're to say, you know, uh, yeah, hell, or I mean, maybe you don't believe in it, but you get the idea, general
Yeah.
idea. Oh, yeah, it's a a torturous prison for eternity or something like that. You get the idea.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting. I think I did the same thing with Earth. We were talking about that because I was like, well, this isn't an Earth. It's not, it's a world, but I want to say like, he's like the Earth God. But
Hmm.
then it's like, what is Earth then become? So it's interesting to see like how you can change those things. And I think the most important part about all of this is that readers want to read something new, but they want to read something that they can understand. So
Yeah.
it's,
Mhm.
if you go through and you rewrite an entire world and religion and people have no idea, or the periodic table, and people are going to spend half of the book trying to figure out what the heck you're talking about, and they're
Mhm.
not going to ever be able to get into that book because it's going to become work to get through it.
Hmm.
So I think that's really the challenge as a writer, right? Is to
Hmm.
find that perfect combination of something that has a new spin on it, but it's relatable or it's normal enough that people understand what it is that you're trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, heavens, and yeah, you just use relatable words. I mean, I guess. I think that's okay. I wouldn't have any complaints with that.
Yeah.
I just think the schlep thing would be that's very cultural,
Mhm.
and I get it. Like it's we're if we heard it, it'd be like, well, it's not a positive thing. It's not a compliment. Uh, I don't think, right?
Well, it's like, no, it's to move things. I'm
Oh,
schlepping something across town. And so it's like,
see, I don't know. It's to me,
yeah,
it
so it's
sounded
like,
like an idiot or something.
well, so it's like a couple of soldiers that were like moving something and they're like,
But a
"Oh, we got to
schlep,
schlep this back and
Yeah,
forth." And it's like, It's like
Ah,
this
okay.
attitude of like, "Hey, what are you making me do
What would
here?
I
Like,
know?
you're making me
Yeah.
schlep this all like," and
Ah,
like,
okay.
they're just complaining about something, and it's
Right,
just like
yeah.
it's a word that I use in my daily life
Sure,
because it's like
yeah.
I use words from all over the world. Like
Yeah.
it, it's normal. It's part
It
of being an
is.
English speaker.
Yeah.
It's hard
I
to
think,
avoid.
yeah, and I think everything is subjective too, right? Like what means something to one person is not going to necessarily mean the same thing to another person.
Yeah.
So that's again something that you really have to work into
Mhm.
your piece, right? So that it can be understood however it's supposed to be meant.
Right. So I have a question. I don't know how this is related. It's somewhere in there, and it has nothing to do with movies. But Holly, first you had said like, "Well, I don't have any religions going on," and then you said, "Well, wait, I have witches." Now, and we're also talking about not offending, right, people, and
Mhm.
we know that there are witches. They practice Wicca, right, and other forms of magic. I'm sure, or whatever their belief is. So, Holly, This is for you, I guess. How are you writing about witches? Are you doing some you know some research on that? Have you talked to anybody or?
Yeah, so I have just started doing some research
Mm,
because so when I first started writing this book, I had no intention whatsoever of having this being a big witch book. It's not something I had ever thought about writing about. So when I did my outline, and I was, starting to flesh this whole world out, I knew that they would be there, but it wasn't really a huge, major, important part. So now, once I get into the editing, it's definitely something that I need to go back through and focus on a little bit more. Now, with that being
Mhm.
said, now that it has become basically the main character in this book is a witch. So obviously it's pretty prominent now. I have two different types of witches. So I have the Aluan witches, which are witches who use herbs and work off the land and things are, they can use elements
mhm,
to enhance their power. And
mm,
then I also have the Stygian witches.
mm,
And so
Mm.
that is actually where I had to be really careful because the Stygian witches were more into sacrificial magic.
mhm,
And so that is a big point in my novel is that everyone thinks sacrificial magic that's bad,
mm,
right? And
Mhm.
that was a huge part in
mm.
religion is that
Okay.
people thought like, people who practice blood magic or sacrificial magic, they're bad people. And
Okay.
that was something that I wanted to be cautious of in this book. And so what I had actually done is that's part of the plot where it's like, well, sacrificial magic is blood magic, right? And
Mhm,
blood magic doesn't mean you have to kill somebody. It means that you have to make a blood sacrifice. That can be a
Mhm.
cut on a
mhm,
hand or a drop of
mhm,
blood. It doesn't matter how
mhm,
much blood you spill. And
mhm.
yes,
Mhm.
there's terrible people out there who do it that way,
Yeah.
but that's
Yeah.
not the purpose, right? And so it was just trying to rephrase it in a way that it's like, hey, they're not bad witches
So
because this is what the few are not the many.
so this is
Right.
like a like morally gray religions, I guess, belief systems. Would you call it that?
Um, yes and no. There's a few pretty bad
Okay.
characters, I
Yeah,
think,
they could take it to the extreme or
that
something.
take it to the
Mhm.
extreme.
Okay,
And
yeah.
then yeah. So I think that's kind of just how I tried to play it, where it was like this girl has been suppressing who she is for so long because she had always been raised that, these are bad witches. I don't want to be
Mhm.
like that. So I'm just gonna suppress it.
Mm,
Um, but then she later finds out that that is how the humans have changed society and how they have forced us to think about their religion.
mhm,
But that really wasn't the case.
mhm.
So it was
Yeah.
just kind of like I guess a little bit of a story arc where it's like, hey, like, grow and learn. And maybe once you
Mhm.
actually know the history behind it, then it's not quite what it seems.
Okay. Oh,
Yeah,
cool.
I get into that kind of stuff a lot in my books actually, because like one of my main characters is like a head priest of a temple that they do blood sacrifices, and it's like it's one of those things like he sacrifices his own blood at like these monumental points in his life as a signifier of like, hey, I am willing to give a portion of my life in sacrifice. It's like this physical reminder of this metaphysical thing that's happening, and so it's this connection where it's like he's actually pouring it out onto an altar to be closer to his God. And it's like, it could be this dark thing. Like from the outside, it probably seems like this vile, horrible thing. Especially it's like you see this guy show up and he's like covered in scars, all like Killmonger kind of a thing. But it's like,
Mhm.
oh, he's doing it as like this faithful act of service to his God
Mhm.
to remind himself that he is weak on his own. He is flesh and blood, and that in the end that will pass away. And so I think like there are ways to go about, even things that we see on the surface as like, different and like maybe harder to understand, that you can make them really connect with people. It's like that's an understandable thing of like, yeah, we are going to die in the end. And it's a healthy reminder in some ways that we are going to. Now,
Mhm.
do I want to go around cutting myself all the time? No, I don't. But like it says something that this character is willing to do that for his faith. Um, yeah. So
Yeah,
I don't know.
would you say fantasy is probably the genre that would have the most religion? Because I'm thinking probably romance, obviously, probably doesn't have a whole lot. Maybe, I guess, maybe a Hallmark movie because of Christmas. But
I don't
then,
know. I've read some religious romances before.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
So
you're right, you're right. Yeah.
so
Uh,
there's a whole genre of Christian romance, let's be real.
oh, yeah, yeah,
So
yeah. No, no, that's not. I'm just thinking like
right, you're not
as
gonna
far
get
as
as much
world building.
variety probably.
Yeah, as far as world building, like because you guys, the both
Mhm.
of your what you're talking about, mine is just very no, it's the Christian God and that's it. Whereas both of your stories are like really rich and very interesting, and but they're also kind of fantasy, right? Or is there any? I can't remember any science fiction stories. I mean, there are. Please don't get me
Well,
wrong, they're out there. I just haven't seen them yet, but I'm sure
I
there are
mean,
science fiction stories with with a religious not
well, I
not an
mean,
undertone.
Dune for sure,
Oh,
is
you're
like
right. Oh
overtones.
my gosh. That's
Um,
yeah, no, I'm
that's
totally
straight up
wrong.
Islam and like
That was absolutely, yeah, you're absolutely right. Forgot
which
about Dune.
I mean, I'm not being Islamic, like, it's hard for me to, like me not being a Muslim, it's hard for me to talk on, like, how respectful it was, like, it feels reading it,
Mm-hmm.
like he was trying to be respectful, but it's one
Mm-hmm.
of those things, like, I don't know how well that comes off as a person
Yeah.
who is of that faith,
Yeah.
that it's like it's one of those things, like, being an Abrahamic religion, though, like, it has those same core tenets of, like, these it's about peace, and it's about the settling and the forgiveness and all of these things. And so like there is moments of that, but I feel like even that gets hung up on some of the worst aspects of it.
Mhm.
But it's still it feels like he's trying,
Yeah.
whether he did it or not.
That's a perfect example. I completely forgot about Dune.
Now, that being said, that's like one of the hallmark examples of it.
Yeah.
I don't know that there are a whole lot of them
And then you
because it
have
does feel like post
yeah.
religion is a lot of what
And then you
sci-fi
have
is.
George Lucas when he wrote Star Wars, he created the Force,
Hmm.
which is a belief system, but there's nothing behind it. And unfortunately, in Episode One, they jumped into whatever that thing was in the blood in the cells or whatever, which that kind of ruined it
Which
for me. But
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm fine with there being a physical explanation of like that. Like, if my connection to my God was physically explainable, like there's a good book that's interesting about the crossover of this. If anybody's interested, it's called The God Gene, and it's the idea that some people might evolutionarily be more prone to believe in a higher power, and it's
hmm,
just this fascinating thing because it helps us survive. Like having hope helps
yeah,
you survive unsurvivable things.
yeah,
And
sure,
so, like, that's the thing is like if you fall out of an airplane, the likelihood of surviving almost non-existent.
right,
It occasionally happens to people who have parachutes that fail because their body doesn't die of shock because they think they're going to be fine until they know that they're not and it's too late. And so it's just this idea that hope can actually save you from impossible odds.
yeah,
So yeah, it's just this. I don't know. I think there's a cool crossover between science and religion.
mm,
So as a person who taught science at a private Christian school,
right on, okay,
it's an interesting, weird place.
wow.
Yeah, I think too, depending on what you're writing, like for me, because I knew that I wasn't going to be having, my gods and goddesses were not gonna be really prevalent in how the story played out. I did make a point in like my first chapter, I think, one of my characters made a comment about how like the gods hadn't given a crap about this town in a long time or like in centuries or like something like that. So I made it very clear that like religion or my gods were not really a big player in the game that was going on in the story, right? So that's always something you can do too, is if you you don't want to fully dive into like a full explanation of your religion as long as it's not actually important to your story. Um, so yeah, so with that being said, now thinking about that, we have to do our weekly don'ts.
All right. Oh, man.
Unpack
Now that I just
And
gave mine away, now I got to come up with another one.
yeah, way to
that.
throw it
Unpack
out
that,
there.
Holly.
Shoot.
um,
Mhm.
what not to do? I'll jump in there. What not to do? I would say don't complicate it. Don't complicate. Like what Austin and Holly just shared is kind of new to us, as readers. I was able to understand both of them, and both of them sounded both, I guess, complex in what they were, the belief system was, but it wasn't too complex where I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about. And I think Holly kind of mentioned, or what we're trying to get at is also being relatable, and keeping the words simple.
Mhm.
Again, real quick, Joe Abercrombie's first law series. Whenever they mention somebody dying, it's just they're going back to the mud, and I get it. I know exactly what that is, and it's perfect. But
Mhm.
that's what you kind of want to do is don't overcomplicate things, because we don't want to get lost. We want to really enjoy your story, your character, their belief system, and it doesn't have to be a maze, to get there. Does that make sense? Hopefully.
Mhm. Yeah, I would say don't forget to make it about an emotional connection. Like that's such a key thing
That's, yeah, brilliant.
for religious stuff in
Yep.
fantasy in particular too, because it's like you don't have somebody that you can plug into in your real life where you're like, oh, I can connect with this person. They're of that faith. It's like your character is the only person that I can connect with.
Mhm.
And so, which the weird thing that jumped out to me was actually from the Silmarillion, and the introduction of Morgoth, and it's this idea of like the whole world was sung into existence, and Morgoth thought he could make it better, and he's like, I just want to make things better. I
Mhm.
just want to improve things, and he started singing differently, and the discord that he caused in the choir of angels destroys everything and breaks all the chaos that we know from the Lord of the Rings.
Mhm.
And it's like this moment of like relatable, like I can do it better, but oh no, everything's falling apart.
Mhm.
Like whether it's the actual story of the like creation that becomes the emotional thing, or connecting it to the main character and how they relate to their religion, like opening up on a funeral and like how everybody's like mourning, but like you also get to introduce parts of the religion. Like don't forget to make it an emotional thing.
Perfect.
Yeah, I think that's really important too, because that's the whole point of it, right?
Mhm.
So kind of leaning off of that, I just want to say don't be afraid to ask people for help informing your
Mhm.
religion. Like I said earlier, people are more than happy if you ask them. Nobody is ever going to say, no, don't ask me about my religion. They're going to be so happy that you did ask, because that's where a lot of the miscommunication comes from, is when people don't understand another religion. So don't be afraid to ask people and just say like, hey, tell me a little bit more about it. And then from there, don't be afraid to make that, to turn it and make it into something that works for you or works for your story. So if you go out and you learn about a new religion and you're like, hey, like I really like that, but I think that it would make more sense, or it would be better, more important to me if I did it this way, or it would be better for my characters if I did it this way, then you can do that. Just make sure that you're not going out of your way to say like, oh, this is this religion, and then completely going off the rails with it, right?
Mhm.
Hmm.
It's still, let it make sense to your story, but if you are going to change a religion, then just remember to do it in a way that is respectful towards the people that are already practicing that religion.
Mhm.
Yeah,
So, there
100%.
there are as well, just to throw this out there, I know that there's people that a lot of beta readers out there who specifically do things like that, like they're sensitivity readers, I think they're called.
Mhm.
And so that's also something that someone might want to look into or spend some time on finding if they are worried, that they might be towing over a delicate line.
Mhm.
Mhm, and that's something too, like, even if your religion isn't directly, Christian or whatever, like, whatever religion it's even closely tied to. So, like, my first one, they worship their ancestors. Well, like, making sure that's handled in a respectful way to people that have religions, that is a part of it, is important, even though the rest of the fantasy religion is completely made up. There are aspects that do have ties in our world,
Mhm.
and it's important to be respectful because it's like making fun of the idea that somebody worships their ancestors. Like, well, that's not cool. Like, there are
Mhm.
people that like have this deep spiritual connection to
Yeah.
those things, and so like whatever your religion is, you have to understand that there are real world implications to that. Just like there are real world implications to making your character a murderer or a
Yeah.
person who runs an orphanage. Like
Mhm.
every bit of your character, whether good or bad or gray and ambiguous, all of that has real world implications. So,
Mhm.
well, I think that wraps it up for us. So don't forget to write and
It's okay.
It's okay.
I got caught up reading both of the things. So don't forget to write and describe to our channels at the link below so you don't miss any of the Writer's Realm content. We always love to hear from our listeners. So if you have a question or a topic you want us to dive into, get in touch. Until
All
next
right.
time,
Till next
bye,
time.
y'all.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.